I'm Tracy with Clintonville Books, and I am here with Jeffrey Smalldon today talking about his book, That Beast Was Not Me. He is a forensic psychologist, and we are just going to dive right into his story because it's a wild one. Hey, Jeff.
Tracy, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very glad to be here at Clintonville Books. One of the coolest indie bookstores I've been into in a while.
Appreciate that. You tried.
It really is.
You try to be cool.
It's cool.
So just getting started, Jeff, you have had over 5 decades of talking to murderers.
I have.
Yeah, so can you take us on a journey of how that started and who you first reached out to?
Yeah, it's always important for me to point out how young and stupid I was when this story gets underway. I'm 21 years old, senior in college, didn't know much about anything. But I was planning to go to graduate school in English, I knew that much. But I took a course in abnormal psychology, and one day my professor mentioned that he had read Helter Skelter, still the best-selling true crime book of all time about the Manson case. I not only had read that book, I was obsessed with it. I read it in a single all-night caffeine-fueled sitting from about 3 in the afternoon until 11 the next morning. I just couldn't put it down. I thought it was so interesting. And he commented in class one day that he had read it. So I decided I wanted to stay after and talk to him that day. So we talked in the hallway, and I said, one of the things that I couldn't really understand about the Manson case was how some of these young people, many of them who came from backgrounds not unlike my own, could have fallen under the spell of this career criminal. I couldn't figure out the dynamics of how that worked. It seemed as though they had almost become automatons, prepared to do his bidding, whatever he told them to do. And I said to my professor, I wonder if those people are a little more complicated than their depictions in the mass media might suggest. And he said, well, have you ever considered writing to them? And I said, no. The idea of writing to members of the Manson family was so far outside anything I'd ever imagined. I said, no. And I just let it go at that. But that idea kept marinating in my brain. And I let a few weeks go by, and then I thought, well, I'm going to try this. So I started with Manson, and then quickly after that, I began writing to... There's some of you who are familiar with the Manson case, at least the main characters. Susan Atkins, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, Sandy Good, Tex Watson, not knowing if any of them would respond to me. And Manson was the first to. And I had tried to, charm myself or something into his orbit by expressing an interest in his songs, because I knew he was a frustrated songwriter. And he wrote me back a brief note basically saying, you're full of shit, don't bother me with that. He said, you're a phony. If you want to tell me what you're really about, write me back, but don't bother me with this BS. So, slightly wounded, I went back to my desk and I thought, well, I'm going to write him a different kind of letter. So I told him a little bit about me, that I was a senior in college, I'd read Helter Skelter, I was interested in his case, both the real case and the way it had been depicted in the popular media, and I left open the possibility that some aspects of the story had been distorted in the way they had been presented in the media. And then he wrote me back a letter that I came to understand over the next year and a half was unusual for Manson. It was sort of a contemplative letter in which, among other things, he said, that beast was not me. But everyone needs me to be that, so they make me up to be a reflection of all their fears, lies, and bullshit. So there came the title of my book. That beast was not me. And there are other reasons why I chose that title, but that was the main one. He also, in that first letter, told me, "You're my kid, my son, my child, and my love. You've been run to the foot of the cross, and meanwhile they're killing me in prison." And at the end of the letter he said, "Start a garden wherever you walk. You'll never need no one but yourself. Easy, Charles Manson." Very different kind of letter than that first prickly one. So that's how it all got started. And I'll only say one other thing because I think it's interesting about, I wanted to write to Squeaky Fromm because by all accounts she was Manson's second in command and she was not in prison. Crucial distinction. Manson was. I had no idea where she was. Like, how do I get a hold of Squeaky Fromm? I knew the phone book wouldn't be any help. So I thought, well, how can I locate her? I had no idea what state she was in even. So I did a kind of unusual thing. I remembered in Helter Skelter reading about a prosecutor in the office that was prosecuting Manson's case who had befriended her and some of the other Manson girls outside the Hall of Justice in LA. So I thought, this probably won't work, but I'm going to try it. So I wrote to this prosecutor, and I sent him an envelope without an address on it, had Lynette Fromm's name on it, and I said, if you know where Lynette Fromm is, would you mind completing this address and sending it to her? I thought, like, almost no chance this would work. Well, he wrote me back immediately and said, yes, I know where she is. I've already forwarded your letter to her. Of course, he didn't give me her address, but he had sent her my letter, and she responded immediately. So this kind of weird route that I took to her ended up working in a way I never imagined it would. So that was kind of how things got started.
So my major question, well, not major, it's kind of a sidebar thing. Knowing that, murderers and you're a 21-year-old kind of fresh college kid, did you think about having a P.O. box? Or were they sent to? Were they all sent to your home?
They were all sent to my home, and no, I didn't think about getting a P.O. box. But when Squeaky and her roommate Sandy Good, her best friend and another Manson devotee, wanted to know about me. In the first letter, Squeaky wrote me, "Tell us about you." And I thought, well, I don't know how far these women extend around the country in terms of their contacts with other people. I had no idea how big the network of Manson disciples was. So, and when they also wanted a picture of me, and I thought, I don't know about that. So I asked a friend of mine, and he said, no, go ahead. Send them a picture, but make sure it's a picture that doesn't look anything like you. So that's what I did. I sent this kind of old picture, and I told them that I was in school, I was a senior in college, and kind of told them a little bit about my background. Just to jump ahead for a minute, I don't want to get too far ahead, but this is interesting, and otherwise I might not get a chance to mention it. I was graduating from college that spring when all of these correspondences began. I was in Indiana at the time, but for the summer, I went home to my parents' house in Western New York. My dad happened to be a special agent with the FBI, and all of these letters from the Manson people were coming to his address. And my dad said, Jeff, why are you doing this? and I said, well, he was cool. But I said, I have an academic kind of interest in these people. And just to jump ahead to one little, it was only by the end of May, it became clear to me that they wanted me to join their cause. They had clearly been recruiting me. And I got one letter from Squeaky and Sandy that was so bizarre. Telling me essentially, if you have any friends who are willing to help, send them out in the woods, have them kill a hunter, and then put signs on the trees saying they're hunters hunting hunters. They told me to locate some corporation heads that they had beef with. They wanted me to threaten that their arms would be cut off. They said a wave of assassins will sweep through their homes and splash blood from room to room. And at that point I thought, okay, Jeff, you've gotten a little farther than you're really able to do it, so you need to find an exit ramp. And I did, but then 3 months later, Squeaky tried to assassinate then President Gerald Ford, and the FBI found a cache of my letters in her apartment, and they contacted the FBI in Buffalo where my dad worked, and my boss called my dad and said, Jack, the FBI in Sacramento says they found a bunch of letters in Squeaky would-be presidential assassin Lynette Squeaky Fromm's apartment, and the return address is yours. Can you explain that? And so my dad did. But it was bizarre.
That is so, yeah, that is, hindsight when you're a kid. But I feel like, so you mentioned that you kind of have always had this fascination with, how did your mom phrase it?
Quirky people.
Quirky people. So you went to a field trip that kind of talked about the Ford's Theater, and you said that everyone else was all the other children kind of got interested in Lincoln or, like
Civil
War and all of that, and you were interested in the murder plot.
The assassination.
Yeah.
And I was 8. And we went to Ford's Theater, and I was just obsessed with these 8 people who conspired to kill Lincoln. My parents had bought me a little pamphlet at Ford's Theater called The Crime at Ford's Theater. And I just read it obsessively. I still have photographic images of all those conspirators in my brain. And I memorized their backgrounds. And so at a very early age, I was already showing this inclination to want to understand outsiders of all kinds, including killers.
Yeah. So I guess moving a bit forward, can you talk about that next stage in your life after you graduated from high school? You went to after you graduated from college, you went to you were in Ireland for a little bit. Yeah, Purdue.
Went to Purdue, did a master's in English. My plan then was to get my PhD in English, become an English professor. I was fortunate enough to get a grant that allowed me to study for a year at Trinity College in Dublin, also modern literature. And during that year, it dawned on me that I don't think I would fit well in the academic environment, the publish or perish kind of pressures that go along with academia. I didn't think it would be a good fit for me. And I literally had no idea what to do with my life. And to make kind of a long detour in my story short, my mom convinced me to have a go at hospital administration, of all things. I'd never taken a single business course. No accounting, no marketing, no finance, none of that. But I ended up at George Washington University. Somehow they accepted me, presumably because they saw me as, some sort of, outsider candidate who might work out, even though he shouldn't. But they accepted me. I got a good financial grant. And at the end of that, for the second part of the program, we had to do a 1-year residency at a hospital somewhere. And I had friends who were sent to San Diego, Boston, New York, all over the country. I ended up at Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And as I say in my book, I remember being at Riverside in those early days thinking, what in the world am I doing here? I never thought I would really be a successful hospital administration. Maybe you've read about the imposter phenomenon of capable people, but who find themselves in a situation where they think, I don't belong here and I'm not going to do well. Well, that's how I felt. But I kept getting promoted. I got along well with people, and I'd been there, I got there in 81. So I'd been there for 2.5 years, and I was an assistant vice president by December of 1983. And I was at home with my parents in Western New York for the holidays, and I get a call from Riverside's public relations director, and she says, Jeff, I've got horrible news. And I had responsibility for the 138-bed mental health center, as well as some smaller departments, including a very small medical research lab. But when she greeted me that way, I thought there's been another tragedy, because we'd had several in the psychiatric unit. Something horrible had happened there. But she says, Patty Maddox and Joyce McFadden are dead. They were murdered on Friday. And I said, what? No way. I mean, no way. These were two women in this very small medical research department that I had administrative responsibility for. It was located right around the corner from the main hallway at Riverside Methodist Hospital. The murders took place between 4:30 and 5:05 in the afternoon on a Friday. And whoever, both the women were stabbed many times. It was a very brutal crime scene. And whoever committed the murders walked out of the hospital without anyone seeing anything unusual at all. And there was a single door that served as exit and entrance to this small research lab. And everybody was like Joyce and Patty had no enemies that anyone knew of. They were very friendly people. And so we all at Riverside thought, what in the world? Who could possibly have committed these murders? And there were no arrests for weeks and then months, and then a year went by, and everyone had their suspicions about who might have done it, including people we worked with. So the environment there became very weird. And I finally decided, okay, this has been a noble experiment for me, this businessman thing, but I'm going to go back to school, work on my PhD in psychology, and become a forensic psychologist. That's when that became my goal. And of course there's a backstory to the Riverside double homicide, which I cover in my case, in my book. It's very interesting how it all panned out. Mm-hmm. It still remains on the books officially as a cold case.
Yeah. So it's so crazy. I mentioned to you, I worked there, and I was like, when I read that, I was like, I had no idea that even happened. But yeah, so when you were, was forensic psychology, it seems like obviously that is something that you should have been doing all along. Is that something that you, when you, have you been researching, during that time, you're like, this is what I need to be doing?
Not really. But I knew of it by the time I applied to Ohio State and began work toward my PhD. And, after the Riverside murders, which came almost a decade after this Manson chapter I've told you about, I was feeling like, this is just bizarre. Murder is following me around somehow. And after the Riverside murders, I wanted a close vantage point from which to study the minds and motives of killers, Manson family members, whoever committed the homicides at Riverside. And that's what I eventually found for myself. During my career, I worked on close to 300 death penalty cases in both state and federal court, including one of them I write about in the last chapter of my book. It was in Clintonville. I don't know if any of you have been around here long enough to remember it. It's a notorious case. It's a spree killing where this disgruntled former employee of Bank One. He had been fired for inappropriate behavior toward female co-workers, and he was furious, and as it turns out, spent about a year stewing about it and deciding how he was going to seek revenge. And he began his spree on East Tulane, close to Indianola, where one of his former girlfriends lived with her husband and infant child. And he broke in the front door, killed the two adults, killed the infant, and injured another woman who was there. And then he went over to the corner of Indianola and Como, where there's still an apartment complex there, and that's where his former supervisor at Bank One lived. And this is kind of funny. When I was working on my book, I decided I wanted a picture of the sites where he had either killed or attempted to kill people. So I went to that apartment. I think it's got 4 units at the corner of Como and Indianola. And it was during the summer. I was taking a picture from the back, and there was a guy sitting outside reading in the upstairs right apartment, which I knew was the one where Hessler had shot his supervisor, even though he didn't kill him. And I mustered up my courage and walked up the stairs and said, "Excuse me, can I talk to you a minute?" And the guy said, "Sure." And I said, "Are you aware that your apartment was part of a notorious killing spree in Clintonville?" And he said, "No, I had no idea." And then he got very interested in it. And as it turned out, sort of researched the whole case. But he had no idea that he was living in it. Then, after that shooting, Hessler went to the Worthington home of another former girlfriend, rang the doorbell, talked with her father for a few minutes, and then just shot him in his doorway and killed him. And then he headed to Ashland, where another former girlfriend of hers lived with her husband and 4 children. And he had a bulletproof vest on. Fortunately, the police contacted the people in Ashland saying this murderer might be on his way to your house. And so the husband of his former girlfriend greeted him with a gunshot at the back door, and the police then arrested him.
Yeah.
But that case took place mostly in Clintonville.
Wow.
Yeah. But I think I started talking about the close vantage point from which to study the minds and motivations of killers, and 300 death penalty cases gets you pretty close to a lot of killers.
So you talk a bit about your feeling on the death penalty. So you are against the death penalty? What was that like working with prosecutors who were obviously not against the death penalty?
It's a great question, Tracy, because I had to deal with it
Yeah.
very early in my career. And then there were 2 women who worked at the Ohio Public Defender's Office who knew of my interest in working on death penalty cases. We had lunch one day, and I was so green, I didn't really even understand the implications of this, but one of them kind of delicately said, "What's your opinion on the death penalty?" I said, "Well, I'm opposed to the death penalty." And they looked at one another, the 2 women I was having lunch with, and I couldn't tell whether they felt good about that or whether that made me somehow tarnished goods in their eyes. As it turned out, I realized early on that prosecutors were all going to want to know what my opinion was about the death penalty, because if they could, they wanted to portray me in the eyes of the jury as a defense whore, basically. So I had to deal with that. And, it played out many, many times over the years in many, many death penalty trials. And what I liked was to give the defense attorneys, who were the ones who had hired me, they were the ones who had a client who needed to be evaluated, I would give them a set of questions to use in qualifying me. And one of them was, do you have a personal opinion about the death penalty? So I was able to get that on the table under friendly questioning. And then they said, has that affected the way you've done your work on this case? I said, no, it hasn't. And then they would say, had the prosecution hired you to evaluate the defendant, would you have gone about your work the same way? And I said, absolutely. Now, some members of the jury might have thought at that point, this guy is so full of shit, and we're still not going to believe a word he says after he admitted that he's personally opposed to the death penalty. But I felt over the years that I did a reasonably good job at it was never my role to advocate on behalf of the defendant or to advocate for a position about the death penalty. That was for the attorneys to do. My role was to educate the jury about what I had learned about the defendant. So it was never in an advocacy role.
That makes sense too, and because you're there to basically make people aware of who this person is, and so can you kind of go in depth of like maybe how you would profile one of the people that you were assigned to?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word profile because I was never a profiler in the way most people think about that. The profilers that you see on TV shows and so on get involved at the request of law enforcement before they've identified the person who committed the crimes. And the profiler helps them, kind of get a narrower vision of the kind of person who might have committed the crime, and it helps with their investigation. By the time I got involved, the person suspected of committing the crimes had already been arrested, and I was asked to evaluate them. So, usually my role, it depended on how much time I had before a trial. If there was a real trial, it was often a year, and I would see the person maybe 6 or 7 times, interviewing them wherever they were being held, usually a county jail. And then if they went to trial and got found guilty, and in most cases there was no suspense, everybody knew they had committed the crime, then there would be a second phase of the trial. And that's where I would usually come in. It was usually referred to as the sentencing phase of the trial or the mitigation phase. And it was basically the defense's show to try to present evidence to the jury that might cause them to conclude that something other than the death penalty was appropriate for this particular defendant. And that's when I was often called to, sort of tell the story of this person's life. And I know, a lot of people, you kind of roll your eyes at this idea of, okay, they were abused as children and so on. We've heard that so many times, but not everyone who experienced abuse goes on to kill people or kill a bunch of people. What makes this particular person's journey different? And so in a way that was part of my role. What was unique about their life experiences that caused them to become the kind of person who would kill people?
So you found that most of them had those ACEs, so the adverse childhood experiences. Was it more so categorically than most people, or were some people just kind of outliers?
Well, most of them had experienced abusive childhoods where they were under tremendous stress because of family-related issues or issues from outside the family. But, it had a lot to do with, along the way, did they ever come in contact with someone who became a mentor or responded to them in a nurturing kind of way that caused them to go down a different path other than the path of a murderer? There was a certain number of the people I met and evaluated who were sociopaths, or the more popular but somewhat different term, psychopaths. And, what causes someone to grow up to become a psychopath? Well, there's been a lot of research into that, but no clear answers, really. I think most mental health professionals believe that people who become psychopaths were probably hardwired at birth. Something in their genetic makeup created a particular vulnerability to them ending up traveling a criminal path. But had certain things occurred along the way that latent psychopathy might not have ended up being expressed in the way it was. Maybe they became a really, really successful businessman who didn't care about other people at all, stomped on other people, just wanted what they wanted, damn everybody else, and they behaved like a psychopath, but they stayed on this side of the law.
Wow, that is a lot to kind of think about too. So
we got some of those in our country.
Yeah. So with that, were you not in charge of, but did you kind of do any diagnosing or like kind of work with other medical professionals too? Because I know there's like probably a lot of narcissistic behavior, probably a lot of, like you said, psychopaths and sociopaths. So what was your role within the forensics aspect of it?
I really didn't work like with a team of people. I was usually a sole operator. I was in private practice. Like I didn't work for the state public defender's office or anything like that. I was in independent practice. But on death penalty cases, the one person who I did work closely with was called a mitigation specialist. And that was someone often with a social work background who did a lot of the interviews with the defendant's family members and so on. So I would work very closely with that person. And that person would never testify. I would always be the one who would testify, but we would collaborate on putting our information together before I appeared in court.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know each chapter, so the cool thing about the book is that it's not, because I know some books that can be more documentary style and they're like, okay, then this happened and then that happened. So this kind of goes through your life and like as a through line to how you met with the different folks that you were in contact with. So can you talk a little bit more about the folks that are pictured on the book and like the different, and how you came in contact with them? I don't want to give too much away, but it's just too good.
One of the things, I knew the kind of book I wanted to write, maybe the only kind I could write, about my own experiences. I thought, by any barometer, you've traveled kind of an unusual path in life, and it might be of interest as a series of thematically related stories. And it began with the Manson people. When I was like either about to begin or already working on my PhD at Ohio State, I decided, the Riverside murders were still unsolved. And so I decided first on death row in Florida is someone who I think knows something about serial murder, Ted Bundy. Though he was still denying everything, saying, oh, this is all just a horrible misunderstanding. But he was on death row, having been convicted and sentenced to death in 2 separate cases, suspected of as many as 100 murders in Oregon, Washington, Utah, Florida. So I thought, well, maybe if I could develop some rapport with Bundy, he would eventually provide me with some clues about how the Riverside murders could have happened and how someone who did them could have kind of disappeared into thin air, because that's what Bundy did a lot of the time. People just couldn't believe, I just saw this woman 3 minutes ago and she disappeared on her way back to her dorm. Nobody saw anybody. So Bundy committed crimes in this way. He was kind of like a ghost-like figure. And so I wrote him a letter, and he didn't answer. At the end of my letter, and he would have known from the content of my letter that I knew a lot about his case. It was pretty long. I wrote it by hand, thinking maybe it would add a little bit of a personal touch, and he would have known I knew a lot about his case from what I wrote in my letter. And at the end I said, I'd really like to have a dialogue with you about some of these issues. I hope you'll be willing, but if you don't respond to my letter, you'll never hear from me again. I'm not trying to bother you. If you don't write me back, you'll never hear from me. So he didn't write me back. I assumed that was the end of it. That was that. And then about a year later, I brought this just in case people would be interested in it. About a year later, I get this letter from Bundy. And keep in mind, like, Bundy's signature characteristic was the unbelievable distances that he would travel in search of his victims. You know, he was a multi-state predator. It made it very difficult for law enforcement to link his crimes at first. So he was known in FBI parlance as a rover. And after a year, he writes me this letter. It's brief enough for me to read it to you in its entirety. But what's most interesting, well, two things that are particularly interesting about it. One is the kind of professorial tone, like, you'll see what I mean, but he's like talking as though he's a source of wisdom, and I've come seeking his wisdom. And then the sign-off of the letter is where things get really interesting. This is December 1985. I've just begun graduate school in August. Dear Jeffrey, you wrote me over a year ago. I've kept your letter all this time. I just came across it amongst my papers. Please excuse me for taking such an inordinately long time to answer it. It was just about the time you wrote that I withdrew into a cocoon of sorts and ceased writing to practically everyone. I'm only now getting back in touch. Anyway, thanks for your letter. I thought it was especially searching and thoughtful. As for your questions, all I can say is that I've never felt better in my life, spiritually, mentally, physically. I hope the same can be said for you. Take care, watch yourself, travel light. Peace, Ted. And there, I mean, I came to learn in subsequent years, there it was, the serial killer's tease. They love that gamesmanship. I'm sure he thought he was really clever. I was sort of flattered because he knew I would get the joke. You know, travel light, watch yourself. And I thought, you know, that sign-off could be read in two different ways. Looked at one way, it's a recipe for how to avoid falling victim to people like me. Be aware of your surroundings, travel light, take care. But it's also a description of how you need to be if you're going to be successful as a serial killer. Take care, be ready to move at a moment's notice, always be aware of your surroundings, and travel light. So, and I never wrote him back. And I just thought, well, I sort of got a little bit of what I wanted from him, but I didn't get any indication of his desire or willingness to engage in an ongoing dialogue with me. So I thought, well, there's somebody else I've read a lot about who's a serial killer and who's also on death row, John Wayne Gacy, who was found guilty in 1980 of killing more people than any other killer at the time in American history. 33 boys and young men, 26 of whom were found buried in the crawl space under his house right outside Chicago. So I wrote to Gacy, and Gacy was very prickly at first, like Manson had been. He said basically, you know, if you think you know a single thing about me from reading those books, you're wrong. You don't know a thing about me. I'm nothing like what's been portrayed in those books you've read. But he invited me to write him back, and I did. And what followed was a correspondence that stretched over 3 years, on average about every second week, trading letters. And I eventually went twice to Illinois to spend time with him on death row. Each time 2 separate days. So I spent in all about 20 hours face-to-face with Gacy in a death row visiting room that was totally unmonitored. As I found out, I write about it in the prologue to my book. And, you know, it was basically, if you haven't read my book, after about 3 hours with Gacy, I desperately needed to pee. And I realized that I hadn't asked the guard who escorted me to the visiting area, is there a restroom back here? So I finally, you know, who wants to ask a serial sex killer for directions to the restroom? But I had no other option, so I said, John, is there a restroom back here? And he said, hell no. Like I was a 3-year-old. And he said, you're going to have to go out and get the guard. Well, I had a very, very hard time getting the guard's attention. There was no one in sight at the gate and no one who could hear me screaming, as it turned out. So, I mean, this is a bad situation. Eventually, I did get somebody to help me, but I thought, man, here I am with someone who killed 33 people. You know, it's not really too far of a stretch to imagine that he has some pretty serious impulse control problems. And at one point he wanted me to sit next to him at the table while we looked through photo albums and so on. And I thought, I don't want to do that. That's a ridiculous request. But I didn't want to show my fear, so I did it. I went and sat next to him, and you know, he had leg manacles on and handcuffs, but it would have been so easy to put those handcuffs over my head and press my neck. So I arranged my feet on the floor so I could move quickly. Watch yourself, travel light. Advice comes in handy. I was ready to bolt if I needed to, but I didn't, because at that point Gacy still had at least a pipe dream that he might get some relief from the appellate courts, that at least they might overturn his death sentence. So he didn't act aggressively toward me at all, though a few years later, when it became clear that he was going to be executed. So, you know, he basically had nothing to lose. And he attacked a young man who visited him in the same visiting room where I was. And when I read this young man, Jason Moss's book called The Last Victim, that focuses mainly on his relationship with Gacy, I thought, wow, that could have been me. Kind of a sobering thought.
Yeah, definitely.
But anyway, I mean, that's what led me to my contacts with Bundy, and then, you know, much more extensively with Gacy.
So I think now, if you guys, do you have any more? I mean, I love your evidence files. So I'm just going to call them. I'm sure you don't call them that.
I also have a couple of paintings, in case you're interested, that Gacy gave me. I've got 3 of Gacy's paintings, and you know, weirdly enough, like Gacy would say, Tracy mentioned narcissism, and most of these guys are so narcissistic you can't believe it. And Gacy would say to me, you know, I'm not really an artist. But then he thought nothing of using his name in the same sentence with Da Vinci and Michelangelo. He said, I look to them as my models. And he said, you know, Jeff, you should buy some of these paintings while the price is pretty low, because they're only going to appreciate over time. And I'm like, who says that about their own work? But he was very confident, like, these are going to become collector's items worth a lot of money. And I thought, oh, bullshit. But he gave me one painting. I bought 2 others. The 2 I bought, I paid $30 each for. And just to test, when I got on Facebook a number of years ago, after all my family members warned me against it, he said it'll be like a black hole. You'll disappear into it, never emerge. But as soon as I got on Facebook, I became aware, you know, you can join these different groups. And I'd heard about these murderabilia groups of people who seriously collect serial killer artifacts. And I thought, well, I want to sample that culture, find out like who these people are, how they talk to one another, and what they buy, and how much they pay for it. And so I joined a couple of these groups, and I had no intention of selling these paintings, but just to sort of test the market, I posted one day that I have these 3 Gacy paintings, and one guy immediately said, you know, show pictures, you know, post pictures. So I did. And by the end of that day, I was offered $8,000 for 2 of them that I had either gotten free or paid $30 for. So Gacy was right. They dramatically appreciated in value. But I've got a couple here that if you're interested, I'll show you.
Love to see the Da Vinci inspired John Wayne Gacy.
Well, one of these, you've probably all seen the famous Picasso, I think it's ink drawing of Don Quixote on his steed. Mm-hmm. Well, Gacy was a pretty good copier. Like, I always tried to get him to paint what was in his head. He wouldn't do that. But he copied pretty well. You'll see what I mean. But he copied this Don Quixote painting. He said, specifically for me. We got the...
So do you just have these in your house? Like just
No.
It's upside down.
But he called this painting The Quest.
I think it's upside down.
It's upside down.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. He called this The Quest, and he put my initials, JS, on the shield because one of the most prolific liars of the 20th century said he saw me as a quester after the truth. So that's one. The other one, Gacy loved Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And you probably know his reputation for being a clown. He had a registered clown face named Pogo. And he would entertain at children's events and in nursing homes and so on. And keep in mind that this is a guy who had 26 bodies buried under his house in the crawl space. So this is the Seven Dwarfs. Very, very colorful. The copying is pretty good. And note what's in the lower left-hand corner. Shovel. And, had I said to Gacy, I'm a little uncomfortable by that shovel, given the facts of your case, he would have gone crazy. He would have said, Jeff, that's so much bullshit. You're still spouting all the crap from those books you read. That shovel has nothing to do with my case. That's how he would have responded, I know, because of another incident with him. But it was a little joke. It was a tease. Mm-hmm. Just like Bundy saying travel light. Mm-hmm. Gacy would never admit to it being that kind of tease, but it is. It was. He thought he was clever. And, it's Snow White and the Mines. I think that was the name of this picture.
Yeah, they weren't using a shovel, they're using a pickaxe.
Pickaxe.
Yeah.
So.
Oh my gosh.
I've been talking a lot.
No. Yeah, that is very ominous. Yeah.
It
so
was one of the free one?
No. Actually, the free one I don't have. It's just a bizarre picture of like a sailor sitting on a pier smoking his pipe.
You still have it? Huh?
Yeah, I still have it.
Okay.
But it's just kind of a random subject. I'm not really sure why Gacy painted that, but
that one wasn't directed towards you, we just wanted to
no,
he
had it and he gave it to me for free.
So I think now, if you guys have any questions for Jeff, you can take them.
I hope you do.
What is your professional opinion on the shift from serial killers to mass shooters? We're seeing more mass shooters now than serial killers.
It's a good question. I think of the psychology of the two groups as very different. So at least as I see it, it's not like a transition from serial murder to school shooting. I think the understanding of school shootings requires a very different kind of framework. The one thing that they have in common is the desire for notoriety, to be known for something, get people's attention. But oftentimes the school shooters, act out of some kind of focused rage about that school or that school system or something.
And society?
Well, yeah, in a larger case against society, but often they have a narrower focus. So they want notoriety, and they're often willing to die to make this statement. So most of them aren't interested in sticking around to see their name in the newspapers. They usually kill themselves and see themselves as martyrs or something. But the psychology of serial killers is very different in the sense that they're planners, and there's time between each of these murders. There's time for them to cool off, consider what they've done, and plan another one that they usually hope is going to be a closer approximation of their fantasy than the last one or the last ones were. They have a very rich fantasy life. If any of you have read my book, there's a chapter on a notorious Ohio serial killer, Thomas Lee Dillon, who I couldn't believe how richly embellished his fantasy life was. All of his fantasies had a narcissistic theme, him having control, dominance, people paying attention to him, whether, I have one long paragraph, which is a partial list of the fantasies he shared with me. But I guess my point in this context is that they all have these very rich fantasy lives, and the killings, the murders they commit, never quite make it. They're never quite as exciting as the fantasy, and so they repeat it, always looking to get closer to that ideal experience in their fantasy. And the fantasies all have to do with dominance and control and rage. That's a good question. Another.
Why are they usually men?
Yeah, why are they usually men? There have been people who've taken a shot at that question. There's a book, the whole book attempts to address that question and makes the case that the socialization of men, men are socialized to be aggressive and in many cases to have negative attitudes toward women and see women as lesser than them and to assert their power over. And, in a certain few, those negative kinds of feelings, become really pronounced and very pathological beyond what a lot of men who at least, they may be some kind of misogynist, but they're not operating like serial killers do. Well, one thing about serial killers, I'll mention this just in passing, but it's not mentioned all that often because we don't tend to think of people who commit crimes like theirs as being ambitious, but they're very ambitious in their way. They want to be known, they want to be recognized. They're not the kind of people who's going to live a quiet life of low, minor key criminality on the margins of society. They're not that kind of person at all. They're after something that they think of as bigger. And in that Ohio serial murder case I mentioned a minute ago, Thomas Lee Dillon, I can't tell you how many times during my meetings with him he would say, there's never been a crime like these before. He was a sniper, and he would kill people he had no contact with. There was no no known sexual element of any of the crimes. He killed strangers with a high-powered rifle. And he was very conscious of the uniqueness of his crime. He said, has there ever been a crime like this in Ohio? Have you ever heard of a crime like this? The guy just goes out, guy lives at home with his wife and small kid, goes out in his truck, has a few beers and blows somebody away? That's how he would talk. Have you ever heard of something like that?
About himself?
Yeah, oh yeah. He said, I go out, I just blow somebody away, and then I just go back home like it never happened. And then I'd read a little article the next page, and I would say, that's me. I'm the one who took that person's life. But then I'd go to work on Monday, and everything would go back to normal. This is one thing I'll add, because there was a fascinating interview with Thomas Lee Dillon that was done shortly after he pled guilty to these 5 killings in 5 different Ohio counties. His killing years were 89 to 92. And during this interview, the person who was interviewing him, she was a local anchor for a Steubenville television station, and she lobbed this softball question to him. She said, Tom, when you're in your cell and you're maybe trying to go to sleep at night, do you think of these people you've killed? A little softball question like, yeah, of course I think about it. Dillon's response was, he shrugged and kind of grimaced a little and said, no, not really. He said, I think of them as a group, not as individuals. And that spoke so loudly to the lack of empathy of these people. One other, because it's a twin anecdote to that one, and it has to do with one of these paintings I just showed you. Gacy would bring a couple paintings out to our meetings, and he would lean them against the wall at the table where we're seated. And one day he had that painting of the 7 dwarfs. And we're talking about his case. And, I kept pushing him. I knew I could only push him so far. But I was pushing him about these crimes that he had been found guilty of. And every time I got too close or pushed a little too hard, he'd say, I can't talk about that. My attorney said I can't talk about that. And then that part of the conversation would end. But this particular day I was pressing him a little harder than usual, and he said, you know what, Jeff? I got pictures of all of those kids that they say I killed back in my cell. And he positioned his hands like he was holding a deck of cards. He said, I flip through those pictures, I look at those kids, and I think these people are no more real to me than... And he stopped when he didn't know how to finish the sentence. And then he points to this, and he says, they're no more real to me than those cartoon characters in that painting. And I thought, that might be the first true thing Gacy has said all day, that they really were no more real to him than cartoon characters. And it was just that easy for him to kill them.
What's the percentage of, we've been involved with so many cases, what's the percentage of people who were, kind of just roughly, of who were like adamant that, I didn't do anything, it wasn't me, or like Manson, these wasn't me, and then what's the percentage of like him that was like the Ohio killer was like, all me, I did it.
Yeah. I would say the vast majority of death penalty defendants I dealt with knew that the gig was up by the time they were arrested. And they weren't continuing to say, this is bullshit, they got the wrong guy. And their attorneys would show them the evidence that the prosecution had amassed. And most of them said, okay, got me. Mm-hmm. And then, most of them looked to me, I think, as someone who might be able to help them. In the worst possible situation you could find yourself in, having been found guilty of a death penalty eligible murder or murders, and then facing the death penalty and wondering if somebody might do something that would convince the jury not to recommend death. Mm-hmm. And I think they saw me as that person, maybe Dr. Smalldon could help in that way. So most of them were pretty open with me about the crimes they committed, but not all of them.
Okay. Wow. You guys have any more questions?
What do you think about the, what's his name? The Iowa?
Brian.
Koberger,
Do you think he planned to kill all of them or just went awry?
I think it went awry. You know, it's interesting. I've read 4 books about that case. That doesn't make me an expert, but I'm certainly interested in it. And I've read a lot about it, including James Patterson's most recent book called The Idaho
I
Four.
have that one to read.
And you know, I mean, it's a brisk read, like all of James Patterson's books, and it's fun. But he wrote the book before Koberger pled guilty, so he didn't have that, and he knew nothing about motivation. I can't figure out. I've worked on a lot of death penalty cases, and I can't figure out for the life of me why Koberger was allowed to plead guilty and not offer a complete account of what he did, why he did it, how he planned it. It's usually called a proffer, where as part of the plea agreement, the prosecution says, okay, we'll allow you to plead guilty and avoid the possibility of a death sentence, but only under these conditions. And one of the conditions is usually that they give a complete account of what they did, why, how. And that doesn't seem to have occurred in the Koberger case, and I can't figure out why. I don't know the answer to it. I followed it for why he did it. I mean, what I think happened, speculation, but call it informed speculation, is that he targeted Maddie, the one woman on the 3rd floor. She was in bed with her friend, and so he thought he had to kill her too. And then he encountered, you know, I can't think of her name, Xana, in the hallway, and her boyfriend was asleep in their bedroom. And so he killed those two. Why he didn't kill the other woman who he encountered in the hallway is a mystery that no one has really unraveled. I mean, what all the people whose books I've read about it say is that he was in shock. He was in like a tunnel. He was so into what he was doing, and you know, kind of exhausted at that point. And that she, you know, people say, why didn't she call the police until like 11:30 the next day? She encountered this guy with a mask on in her home, in the hallway of her home, the previous morning at like 4 or 5 in the morning. Why did she wait till 11? And everyone seems to settle on the conclusion that she was in shock, that she's some kind of shock, and just didn't know what to do. And, you know, I don't know if we'll get closer to understanding how she processed the whole thing than that. It's an unbelievable case, unbelievably tragic case, obviously.
Have you ever examined or done any research or reading on the Atlanta child murders in the early 80s? Like 70s?
Well, I don't know much about that case, to be honest. I mean, I read that one thick book about it many years ago, but I haven't really kept current. I know there are a lot of people who think Wayne Williams was railroaded and that he didn't really commit those murders, but I really haven't kept up with the debate about that case. Have you?
No, not.
And it's interesting,
Yeah.
for sure. And I know not everyone is convinced that they got the right guy.
That's why I was wondering if you had any insight from like that angle. Like I know that a lot of people think that they have the wrong person.
Yeah, I don't really,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Are you in correspondence with anyone now?
I am not. I'm retired and glad to be. Not that being retired has made me any less interested in the psychology of these people. I will tell you though that, you know, after 25 years of working on death penalty cases and interacting with these kinds of people, I was kind of done with it. Like, I really felt like if I don't see the inside of one more county jail or state prison, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to the point where I kind of hated those oppressive environments. And I always thought, you know, when I would be evaluating, well, I did a lot of my evaluations on death row of people who had already been convicted and their attorneys had their case at some point in the appellate process, and they asked me to see their client and, you know, see whether maybe the psychologist at the trial level had missed something. So I did a lot of evaluations on death row. And every time I left those evaluations, I would think at some level, that guy hates me. As I'm walking out the door, returning to my family, maybe going to have a beer, getting gas in my car, whatever. You know, all those things that comprise our daily lives. And they watch me walk out the door and think, fuck that guy. And that's what I always imagined was going on at some level in their mind, just this bitterness that I could walk out. So I got pretty tired of those oppressive environments, and it'll take its toll on you, believe me.
Yeah.
Who was the scariest, or I don't know if that's the right word, the person you interacted with the most that was probably the most,
For all?
yeah, I guess.
Well, I mean, I would put Gacy toward the top because he came across as so folksy and unthreatening with me anyway. But, you know, I always knew, I'm sitting with this guy, he killed at least 33 people. You know, and I always had that in my mind. I thought, wow, I mean, this is a really deadly killing machine across the table from me. And I knew the whole time I was with him that he was fantasizing about sexually torturing and killing me. Because why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
So I knew, you know, this guy is thinking about me that way. And at one point he said, hey Jeff, it was really good having you here. You looked a lot younger than your age. And I thought, well, if that's the case, then in Gacy's mind, that puts me at the upper part of his range of his victims. So I knew that he was fantasizing about torturing and killing me the entire time I was with him, which was always a sobering thought, made particularly sobering because of how unthreatening he seemed. You know, I mean, these guys have such a well-curated public persona, and it's why they, you know, they identify vulnerable people, and they come across as so threatening. And, you know, they convince people to accompany them to places where the victim becomes really vulnerable. One of the thoughts I often had when I was evaluating these people is, you know, think of the pretty superficial cues that all of us rely on every day to make decisions about who it's safe to be around. I mean, you don't have to accompany someone to an obscure dark alley to be a potential victim. Many of Bundy's victims pretty much disappeared in plain daylight, like in a landing at a hotel when people had just seen them 2 minutes before and expected them back. So just thinking about, you know, the cues that we all rely on. Seems like a nice guy, you know, friendly demeanor. Yeah, you know, I don't feel the least bit threatened with that person. Tells me, you know, could I help with his car down the road? He's got a flat, or, you know, some little gambit calculated to lure me into his net. And that's pretty frightening, I think, because we all do it all the time, make decisions based on those kinds of cues. And when you're sitting across from someone like Gacy, who you know exploited over and over and over again his victim's willingness to go with him or, you know, put them in a vulnerable position with him. Yeah, Gacy would certainly be one of them because he killed so many. And there were a couple guys who were you know, just like there was a certain ferocity in their presentation. They weren't like Gacy. They were so angry that they had been arrested, that they were being charged with this death penalty eligible crime, that they had been caught, that there was probably no way out. And there were some who, you know, they didn't threaten me, but like I said, there was a certain ferocity in their presentation that always made me think, wow, I would not want to be around that person when he was unrestrained and angry, ever.
You mentioned the like murderabilia groups on Facebook and how there are people that collect that stuff. Do you feel that behavior almost kind of enables and like triggers that like notoriety factor in serial killers, and now they know for sure people will collect that stuff? Do you feel like that adds fuel to the fire almost for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely I do. And you know, that's a very weird subculture. If you ever wade into any of those groups, I mean, it's like people exclaim their interest in certain things, or exclaim that they have this item, and it's, you know, I mean, oftentimes they're, you know, like a napkin that somebody authenticated as having been used once by Charles Manson, and people begin bidding for it. Strands of Manson's hair, you know, hundreds and hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands. So yeah, I mean, I think it definitely feeds into that hunger for notoriety among people who commit those crimes. Gacy knew his paintings would, and he would be famous, infamous someday, and that people would be spending large amounts to buy his artwork.
Yeah, it almost feels like it gives them like confirmation for like people that haven't committed those crimes yet, but they see it and they're like, yeah, okay, well I know I'll be famous now for sure. Whereas, you know, some of them without the internet, they didn't.
Yeah.
They thought that, but didn't know it for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally think that's the case.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how much time you allotted, but I probably bored these people. Talked long enough.
No, I don't think. I mean, we could go longer, but I feel like we'd be here all day. So, thank you guys so much for coming out.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
If you would like to purchase one of Jeff's books, they're over there. We have Dr. Smalldon here who could sign them for you.